Good morning. I'm going to attempt to read 4 essays today from June Jordan's book, Some of Us Did Not Die. I'm going to go backwards 4, 3, 2, 1, see how far I get. June Jordan was an essayist, a poet, born in Harlem in 1936 and died 65 years later in Berkeley, California. Hunting for Jews. You looking for me? With those 4 casual words, Aryan Nation member Buford O. Farrell presented himself to the Nevada's FBI August 11, 1999. One day earlier, Farrell was hunting for Jews. He wanted to kill Jews. He wanted America to wake up. He thought that killing Jews would help to interrupt a dangerous national sleep during which the spawn of the devil, Jews, blacks, homosexuals, had gained something or other powerful and good at the expense of Christian white people. On August 10th, Farrell attacked the Los Angeles Jewish Community Center, firing in China Naranko 9mm semi-automatic rifle. Farrell wounded 5 Jews, including 3 small children. One of these victims, 5-year-old Benjamin Kadish, remains in critical condition as I write. On August 10th, just after his furious assaults, Farrell then spotted somebody he presumed to be an Asian or Hispanic or, in short, not white. Farrell shot and killed this man, Joseph Santos Ianto, with 9 bullets fired from a Glock 9mm semi-automatic gun. Because I do not watch TV, I did not know about Farrell and the LA shootings until the morning afterwards when the Times arrived and I saw a still photograph of cops leading pitiful strands of Jewish children holding hands across what looked like ghastly uninhabited space. The night of the shooting and that murder, I had been reading my mail rather carelessly, but until I came across a large Xerox or another photograph of many people crowded together with a blue ballpoint pen circle drawn around their heads. In the margin, also scrawled in ballpoint pen, there appeared this explanation: my mother and my brother. I looked more closely at the Xerox and wondered who might have sent that picture to me and why. Rifling through the papers on my table, I found the covering letter. It came from 70-year-old Ellie Goss, born Berkovitz, who was thanking my students for poems written to her almost a year ago. I heard Ellie Gross in an interview with Laura Flanders on Pacifica Radio and was stunned by her matter-of-fact tenacity. I rushed to my class to tell about this amazing woman, this Auschwitz survivor who was now a plaintiff against Volkswagen. Ellie Gross is part of a class action suit seeking compensation for the slave labor enjoined upon her and thousands of other Jews in 1944. What struck me to my soul was her spontaneous on-air declaration. She said, "I guess it was my destiny to live." She meant that her life hopes to honor the memory of her mother and her 5-year-old brother who were waved to the left to their death by a white-gloved Nazi officer on June 2nd, 1944, while she was waved to the right, first to Auschwitz and then to slave labor at Fallersleben. She meant that to live is not a given. To live means you are owed something big to those whose lives are taken away from them. She was alive. She was hoping to make things right by testifying to the heinous wrongs committed against her and her family and her people. 55 years beyond 1944, and here comes this heavily armed, self-righteous, white supremacist Jewish hunting Jews in Los Angeles, California. And on that Wednesday morning after Farrell opened fire, I confronted an up-to-date newspaper photograph of Jewish children struggling for safety. Next to me, I placed the old Xerox photograph taken moments before the Nazis sent Ellie Gross' mother and brother to the left to be gassed at Birkenau. It was more than a half a century later, and here we go. Here we were again. And here we are. Finally, there's a headshot of Joseph Santos Eo printed finally in the paper. He could have been my father or my son. Buford O'Farrell Jr. is a member of the Aryan nation, and leveling his murderous aims at Jews and one Asian or Hispanic, Filipino, American, he has earned his entry into Phinehas' priesthood. In the Bible, Numbers 25, Phinehas murdered an Israelite who brought into his brethren a Midianish woman in the sight of Moses. Phinehas, when he saw it, the interracial, intertribal coupling, he rose up and took a javelin in his hand. And he went after the man of Israel into a tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. So the plague was stayed from the children of Israel. And the Lord spat unto Moses, saying, Phinehas, hath thy turned wrath away from the children of Israel, while he was zealous for my sake among them? Wherefore say, behold, I give unto him my covenants of peace. Today it is Christian identity followers who aspire to such zealotry and divine acclaim. Through a literal elimination of those perceived to be apart from God's wish, or those who do not qualify for God's white people, the Phinehas priesthood publicly confirms its own violent notions of religious and racial virtue. In June, a gay couple was murdered near Redding, California, and 3 Sacramento synagogues were set afire. 2 brothers, Matthew and Tyler Williams, have been arrested and charged with all of these crimes. In connection with this violence, police have been investigating organized white supremacist activity. In the June 24th San Francisco Examiner, William Pierce, leader of the National Alliance, has reported thus: we have a number of people in the Sacramento area, but they don't get involved in the burning of synagogues. That's strictly against our policies. On the other hand, Matt Howell, head of the World Church of the Creator, responded in this way: certainly there is nothing immoral about torching the den of the serpent. In July, Benjamin Nathaniel Smith murdered a black man and a Korean American man. He also wounded 6 Orthodox Jews and 1 Taiwanese American before killing himself. The rampage took place in India and Illinois. On October 11th, Buford O'Farrell told the FBI officers, "You're looking for me." The next essay we will be reading is The Invisible People, A Far Stretch Well Worth the Effort. A far stretch, well worth the effort. I've heard forever about Tang poetry. It seems that no poems were ever so beloved or so marvelously composed as these. There were 300 of them, I was told, and Chinese children memorized huge numbers of these jewels as a matter of course. But everywhere I looked, I could not find an English translation even suggesting such amazing accomplishments. Yes, here and there the imagery astounded this reader, but nowhere did I encounter a river of poetry to carry me pell-mell into this aesthetic delight and sensual enlightenment. Then one afternoon, a guest speaker came to my class at UC Berkeley to describe distinguishing attributes of the Chinese language. I listened almost in disbelief, roughly summarizing what he said. There is no gender, and no pronouns, no past or future tense, no inflections of verbs, and no plural case, and no prepositions, and no definite or indefinite articles. And this is the language, the carrier of the conscious of the majority population of the world. Fantastic. Haphazardly, but with tremendous excitement, I continued my readings. Finally, I ran into an introduction to Tang poetry that described these poems as extremely musical, a fixed-end rhyme scheme, a fixed number of lines, and all stressed syllables, because in the Chinese there would be no possibility of a 2-syllable word. Then in a phone conversation with my best friend's husband, who is a Tang poetry scholar, I learned that these poems were always sung aloud and not intended as written in silently absorbed events. With this information, I felt, as I certainly do feel tonight, the chasmic separation between myself, a captive of the English language, and the absolute treasure of poetry that human beings have created in languages I cannot even imagine. Translation then becomes a necessity and at the same time a chimerical undertaking that we embrace because something faithfully attempted is sometimes, although not always, better than nothing. In relationship to Tang poetry, I decided to assign myself and my students the entirely nobling task of writing Chinese and English Tang poems that hold to the most striking, clear attributes of the Chinese language when written in English. A few weeks later, my students and I confronted this assignment. Once again, first we thought we should decipher the worldview bespoken by Chinese attributes of the Chinese language. We concluded that in Tang poetry there is no personal subject, no pronouns, no subject-object, or fixed fluid syntax, no subject acting on object, no subject distinct from a predicate, no poet apart from his or her environment, and therefore no acceptable English translation of a Tang poem. On the other hand, we decided in Tang poetry you will find fluid interrelationships, equality and value among all elements, words, humility, the poet as a part of all that is, collective cultural illusion, precision and multiplicity of meanings versus either or formulation or surmise, and an intimate musical composition. Well, one of my students wondered, how would you say she followed me home? So with my students, I worked out the answer to this question, and this is what we composed. She followed me home, footsteps sound, skirt flare, run near, dare, path share, stare, eye, flirt, sneak, smile, find face, flush, heart bare. And later that night on my own, I wrote this other Tang poem, just for the thrill of it. Heat, sound, pound, plum, spill, ground rise, fruit, fall, fill, air, splash, branch, rain, wash, chance, start, heart, kill, chill. And by the way, another wonderful thing about Tang poetry in English is that the poem can work on the vertical as well as the horizontal. For example, to return to our collectively composed Tang poem, you can also read it. Foot run, stare, fine, step near, eye, face, sound, dare, flirt, flush, skirt, pass, sneak, hard, flash, share, smile, bear. And with a little bit of work, you can make the vertical lines abide the same rhythm scheme that governs the horizontal. I hope that some of this happiness provided by and provoked by translation issues of need and differences appear perhaps a bit more obvious and less daunting now. The Invisible Report, a unsolicited report on Black rage. We do not play. 90% of us or more voted for Gore nationwide. I would have been amazed if we voted any differently. The distinguished political science Charles Henry exclaims. He's the chair of the African American Studies program at UC Berkeley, and he speaks without hesitation. As an electorate, we are very sophisticated. In rapid fire, he cites several instances when black folks shifted our votes to whatever column held the most for us on a programmatic level. Besides, he amplifies per income grouping. We weigh in more active than white Americans, more aware of the differences among candidates, more tuned to the content of the choice, and more likely through daily conversations and even literal organizing efforts to keep political matters front and center. He's talking with me as readily as, just an hour before, Nobel laureate Toni Morrison answered my call. I rung her up and asked, "What do you think of this mess, this stolen election?" The questions themselves evidently relieved her from a punishing sense of isolation and disregard. Until I asked, nobody from the national media had bothered to make an inquiry. "It's more than sinister," she said. "It's really frightening on every level I can think of. And you know there's always been a fascist strain here. It's not even political in the sense of this party or that. It's like a virus that can attach itself to Democrats or Republicans or whatever. And we know it's around. We can tell because black people are the nexus. United States politics have always been determined by the South. Look at the New South, or under Nixon, the Southern strategy. It's finally about how presidential candidates make accommodations with the South. It's about race. Because what doesn't change is the dispossessing and disenfranchising of the black folks. That's precisely what the Electoral College was invented to guarantee, to give power to smaller states that allow no women and nobody black to vote. As eagerly and with comparable passion, Robert Allen, editor of the Black Scholar, tells me, of course it was first and last about race, this stolen election. And then Gore didn't want to touch it because Gore didn't want to break with white supremacy, even though that meant he'd lose the election. That's how much white supremacy means to him. Can you imagine he'd rather lose the presidency than stand with black folks? And then I was standing with Sweet Honey in the Rocks, Bernice Johnson Reagan, who was preaching clear as clear. Oh, we really do vote against people. We're voting against Bush, against Ashcroft, and the rest of it. And you know, because we know you have to play the game that's on the board. We didn't have time for Ralph Nader or anybody like that. This is too serious. And now you look, if I wasn't living in it, I wouldn't believe it. Observing that 54% of eligible black voters made it our business to vote, Reagan said, now we have to push for 84%. Let's expose the system. It's a system set up for low turnout. So let's push it. Let's make it collapse. Let's see how many elections they can try and overthrow. Everywhere there should be a voting inspection team to create a lot of heat. Every university should be examining the electoral process closely right where it is. Make it the number one ongoing research. Get the students to do the investigations. We have to be inventive and make this one fired up little country. You know, we need to keep the culture of rage, keep it spiked. You have to dig deep to go back as bad as this. You have to go back to Rutherford B. Hayes and Plessy versus Ferguson. I'm saying let's make it 84% in 2 years and then see what happens. Toni Morrison still mourns for many black people who died just trying to secure or exercise the right to vote. And she says, oh yes, vote. Dress yourself up and vote. Even if you only go into the voting booth and pray, do that. It's the ritual of respect for the blood shed so we could do this thing, so we could, we would count. When I tell her I've spoken with Bernice and what she said, Toni is audibly happy, audibly relieved. She says just having our long-distance phone conversation is a big help out of the isolation and the disregard. Bernice gives me a big hug and a big smile while I convey Toni's thoughts and the love that Toni sends to her. All four of these African Americans share a raging and a sorrow at the discount of our people. We have moved from the invisible man to the invisible people. It's raging and a sorrow at the terrible meaning of that discount for us and for democracy itself. All four of these faithful Americans have devised per force a survival of the greater evil more than once in their lives, and so they view this most recent triumph as the greater evil with profound shock, anger, and alarm. As Toni Morrison sees it, this is not just the Republicans, this is the crowd in control of the Republicans, which is terrifying. So if they do what they used to do, like encouraging recession and starving our public schools, the future is very, very bleak. And while these four faithful Americans have struggled through the absolute bleak before, there is an absolute difference now. In contrast to the days and weeks and years of civil rights revolution, we don't have any outlets or newspapers, any media. It's like Pravda, Tony declares, or worse, because there's no news. For example, you wouldn't know there were truly massive protests in D.C., or who would know about the speeches and demonstrations in Tallahassee. It's a capitalistic uh, consolation of the press, with consequences the same as Pravda, horrifying distortions and sabotage, to which I must add, whites only, in the public consciousness and on the public forums. Where is there record of any major national newspaper or TV channel attempting before, during, and after the stolen election of 2000 to find out what black people were thinking and why? How was it acceptable to what's termed the American left that until January 25th, 2001, nobody asked our poet, a Nobel laureate, Toni Morrison, for instance, for her thoughts and her feelings about our national crisis? And certainly nobody asked me to write this report. And where does this disregard and indifference to our black presence, our black range connote? Well, we're pushing on towards an 84% turnout, black turnout, or in 2002. We'll expose the system. We're going to push and push and push and make it collapse, whether you're ready or not. And finally, introduction. Some of us did not die. Once through the fires of September 11th, it's not easy to remember or recognize any power we continue to possess. Understandably, we shrivel and retreat into stricken consequences of the catastrophe. But we have choices, and capitulation is only one of them. I am always hoping to do better than to collaborate with or whatever or whomever it is that means me no good. For me, it's a mind game with everything at stake. For example, what kind of surgery blurred or blocked or buried alive? This is an excerpt from my poem, To Take Back the Night. What about moonlight? What about watching for the moon above the tops of trees and standing still enough to hear the raucous crickets chittering invisible beneath the soon-lit stones? What about moonlight? What about moonlight? What about watching for the moon through the windows low enough to hear the screams and curses of the street, of the gunshots and the drunken driver screeching tires and the boombox big beat and the Tinkle Bell ice cream truck inside? What about moonlight? What about moonlight? Luckily, there are limitless new ways to engage our tender and possible responsibilities, obligations that our actual continuing coexistence here in these United States and here in our world require. For example, the great Afghan poet Rumi has written, "Bird song brings relief to my longing. Please, universal soul, practice some song or something through me." Thank you very much, Bernard Woman Center, and thank you, Bernard College, for your notice and your faith. Thank you for asking me to speak out loud about the rough-hewn trajectories of my poet's life. I am rather late as I try to tell you tonight about my gratitude. Back in 1975, I wrote, to be honest, or I look for and I work for defeat of international evil, indifference, and suffering, only when I'm not otherwise stunned by the odds, temporarily paralyzed by the revulsion and grieving despair. But life itself compels an optimism. It does not seem reasonable that the majority of the peoples of the world should finally lose joy in rational justice as a global experiment to be pursued and fiercely protected. It seems unreasonable that more than 400 million people right now struggle against hunger and starvation, even while there is arable earth aplenty to feed and nourish every one of us. It does not seem reasonable that the color of your skin should curse and condemn all of your days and the days of your children. It seems preposterous that gender that being a woman anywhere in the world should elicit contempt or fear or ridicule or and serious deprivation of rights to be, to become, to embrace, whatever you choose. At Bernard, there was one great teacher whom I was privileged to know, Barry Unilof, and in freshman English, I remember two assignments for which I will always feel gratitude. One was a paper that would pull together, I think he said somehow, Alfred North's Whitehead's Aims of Education and Edith Hamilton's Mythology. Many of my classmates became more or less suicidal as they reflected on this task, but I thought, damn, if you can synthesize Whitehead with Greek mythology, then maybe you can bring the Parthenon to Bedford-Stuyvesant and make it all real. Back then, I meant to say that Bernard College never gave me the connection between the apparently unrelated worlds of black and white, but that is not quite true because there is no obvious given connection between Bernard and Bedford-Stuyvesant. I had to discover and invent that connection for myself, which is worthy work for anyone for sure. And because this, Bernard, was the Parthenon, I got to thinking about how some of us choose to remember and why and how and why we do not forget. And I got to thinking about the moral meaning of memory per se, and what it means to forget and what it means to fail to find and preserve the connection with the dead whose lives you or I want or need to honor with our own. Before Bernard, I didn't even know there was a Parthenon or a Parthenon or a Parthenon. These ideas are at least as much as they are standing, if mostly ruined, remains of human pride and hope in reaching for impossible and imperative accomplishments. So however belatedly, thank you for that, and thank you for the man who became my husband and the father of my son. In between classes in the middle of campus, I met him on a very cold day. He stood without shivering behind a small table on which an anti-McCarthy petition and pages of signatures lay blowing about. He wore no overcoat, no gloves, no scarf, and I noticed that his cheeks seemed almost bitterly red with the wind. Although that happened some half a century ago, I remembered he wore a bright yellow Oxford cloth button-down shirt open at the neck and no tie. He explained the petition to me, but I wanted to do something else. I wanted to excuse myself and find him a cup of coffee so he'd keep warm enough to continue standing out there brave against Senator Joe McCarthy and the witch hunts that terrorized America. He looked like a hero to me. It really was cold, and he really didn't care. He stood there by himself on purpose. I went away to bring him back a cup of coffee, and as I recall, that same afternoon I told a couple of my friends that I had met the man that I would marry. That was 1954. He was a 20-year-old senior at Columbia College. I was 18 and a sophomore at Bernard College across the street. It would be hard to say which one of us was younger or more ignorant of the world beyond our books, our NAACP meetings, school parties, ping pong, running hikes through Van Cortlandt Park, or our exhaustedly romantic letter writing at the rate of 2 or 3 letters a day. But he was taller and stronger, and he was white. We were not the same, and beginning then inside the interracial, state-criminalized relationship, I learned all the way to my knees the sometimes terrible consequences of differences, the sometimes fatal response of religious and of political and social systems set against differences among us, differences characterized by those most powerful as deviant or pathological or blasphemous or beneath contempt. The confrontation with heavyweight intolerance carried me through our civil rights revolution and into our resistance to the war against Vietnam, and then into the realm of gender and sexuality politics, and those strivings in aggregate carried me from Brooklyn to Mississippi to South Africa to Nicaragua to Israel to Palestine to Lebanon and to Northern Ireland. And every single one of those embattled baptisms clarified pivotal connections among otherwise apparently disparate victories and among apparently disparate events of suffering and loss. Issues of community control in New York City's public schools plunged me into a complicated facets of self-determination. And then again, my personal recovery from actual rape catapulted me into a difficult question about resistance as a reluctant attitude for anyone who believes he or she has been violated or debased. In turn, several intricate problems of resistance have taken me into repeated attempts at overview constructions and analysis of the worldwide absurdity of endangered female existence. I mean, why is our universal situation? And when will we revolt against our marginalized pseudo-maverick status and assert our majority, our indispensable to the species power? And I do mean power, our verifiable ability to change things inside our own lives and the lives of other folks as well. For example, I attended one of the best prep schools for girls in this country, and then I came here to Bernard. And I did not understand the fantastic privilege such an education implied. I think I more or less tolerated school because to me it was just that, school. And yet here in this new millennium we are struggling with the consequences of that abysmal fact of that education, that basic literacy in fact is not God-given or sovereign state attainment or entitlement. As a matter of fact, education is denied to most female beings on the planet. And even if you disregard the significance of that for girls and women, you just might nevertheless begin to care about the documented correlations between the illiterate female populations and the impoverishments, the barbaric hardships of every society maintaining or imposing such an unequal, such a literal suffocating status quo. Before the Taliban took over most of Afghanistan, 90% of the girls were illiterate. After the Taliban, it is virtually 100%. Now, some of us knew about these deplorable conditions quite a while ago. In my 1993 essay, I Am Seeking an Attitude, I wrote, it took longer than an excusable indifference for folks inside the United States to raise an outcry against the documented systemic genocidal rape of more than 2,000 mostly Muslim women and girls inside the former Yugoslavia. And it's still all quiet on the documented horrifying fate of women and girls inside of Afghanistan. And yet it was years later, not because our official government cared about the sisters of the Taliban before U.S. policies stopped supporting the Taliban. Indeed, it was American feminists, including Jay Leno's wife, who agitated for censure of horrible Taliban practices. And nevertheless, as recently as 4 months ago, George W. Bush gave the Taliban $43 million. Why? To cajole Taliban cooperation with our war against drugs. Clearly a war more important than a war against maiming and the annihilation of Afghan women. I have evolved from an observer to a victim to an activist, passionately formulating methods of resistance against tyranny of any kind. And most important, I think, is this: I face my own culpability, my own absolute dirty hand, so to speak, in the continuation of injustice and powerful intolerance. I am discovering my own shameful functions as part of the problem. At least I no longer think they are this or that, or rather we or I am not doing enough. For instance, I have not done my homework, and so on. And here is one poem from my Kosovo suite. April 10th, 1999, the enemies proliferate by air, by land. They bomb the cities, they burn the earth. They force the families into miles and miles of violent exile. 30 or 40 or 81,000 refugees. Just before this checkpoint, who knows where they disappear. The woman cannot find her brother. The man cannot recall the point at all. The papers somebody took. Away from him the rains fail to purify the river. The darkness does not flow. The trembling message of the tanks. Hundreds of houses on fire, and still the enemy seeks and finds the enemies. Only the ones without water, only the ones without bread, only the ones without guns. There is international TV, there is no news. The enemies proliferate, the homeless multiply, and I watch, I wait. I'm already far and away, too late, too late. And as I wrestled against my own violence, my own instincts to strike back, to strike out and smash what hurts me or my people or my country or my ideal aspirations for my beloved America, I have written in part. The bombing began and did not terminate for 42 days, and 42 days, relentless minute after minute, more than 110,000 times. We bombed Iraq, we bombed Baghdad, we bombed Basra, we bombed military installations, we bombed the National Museum, we bombed schools, we bombed air raid shelters, we bombed water, we bombed electricity, we bombed hospitals, we bombed everything that moved. We bombed everything that did not move. We bombed Baghdad, a city of 5.5 million human beings. And then getting strictly personal and strictly political at the same time, I wrote Soldier, the story of my childhood. Maybe I should have been born a boy. I think I dumbfounded my father. Whatever his plans and hopes for me, he must have noticed now and again that I, his only child, was in fact a little girl modeling pastel sunbonnets, color coordinated with puffy sleeve dresses that had to accommodate just in case cotton handkerchiefs pinned to them. I'm not sure, regardless of any particulars about me. He was convinced that a Negro parent had to produce a child who could become a virtual white man and therefore possess dignity and power. Probably it seemed easier to change me than to change the meaning and the complexion of power. At any rate, he determined to transform me, his daughter, into something better, something more likely to succeed. He taught me everything from the perspective of a recruiting warrior. There was a war on against colored people, against poor people. I had to become a sage soldier who would rise through the ranks and emerge a commander of men rather than an infantry pawn. I would become that sturdy, brilliant soldier, or he would, well, beat me to death. And sometimes I suspect whenever any of us feel defeated, we may think maybe everybody should have been born a boy. Maybe everybody should have been capable of the awesome and inspiring heroism of our firefighters and our police, who sought only to retrieve and rescue living and the wounded from the infamy of September 11. Maybe we should all of us be strong that way. Maybe that would be easy all around, but there is also the humble love of Ruth and Naomi I will place right next to the daring do of David's love of Jonathan. There is the bravery of the women in black who, for more than a decade, hold public silent vigils to end the illegal Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territory. There are ridiculed pink ribbon people against violence in the bedroom, the kitchens, the streets, and in our domestic and foreign priorities. There is the bravery of a woman against evaporation of violence in the force rather than the valoration of a negotiating wish and commitment to make merciful and just our coexistence with really different people, trying always to fully and freely live on this one earth. So I'm okay with being a girl and becoming a woman. I'm fighting breast cancer, and it's not a readily visible contest, but you know it's mine, and it's also a fight that a stupendous number of other women have no choice about. Ode 2, written during chemotherapy at UCSF, or Ode I'd really rather be sailing or failing to dive fast enough so fish marvel at the rapidity of my descent into the sea so deep even sperm whales move on sound so dark even what's electrical will not ignite into a luminous event. I'd rather be flying a line beside somebody's lift my lips to lips, adverse to words, lips articulate as colorings of an eye, about to blink, just about beyond just lust. I'd rather be no answer or no cancer, always stuck inside gray company or frail or ball or sagging melodrama, intravenous drips and problematic pokings in my veins, and daily pills that kill acuity of consciousness and stats that say, that's it. Oh, no lie, I'd rather be somebody's sweet potato pie. In 1999, I published an essay, Are You Hunting for Jews? You're Looking for Me. And those four words, those four casual words, Aryan Nation member Buford O'Farrell presented himself to the FBI in Las Vegas on August 11th, 1999. One day earlier, Farrell was hunting for Jews. He wanted to kill Jews. He wanted to wake America up. He thought that killing Jews would help to interrupt the dangerous sleep between which was the spawn of the devil. Jews, blacks, and homosexuals had gained something other powerful and good at the expense of Christian white people. And then a few weeks later, I heard an Auschwitz survivor, Ellie Gross, in an interview with Lord Flanders on Pacifica Radio. Ellie Gross had been part of a class action suit seeking compensation for slave labor forced upon her and thousands of other Jews in 1944. What struck me to my soul was her spontaneous on-air declaration. She said, I guess it was my destiny to live. She meant that her life hopes to honor the memory of her mother and her 5-year-old brother, who were waved to the left to their death by a white-gloved Nazi officer on June 2nd, 1944, while she was waved to the right, first to Auschwitz and then to slave labor at Fallenben. She meant that to live is not a given. To live means you owe something big to those whose lives are taken away from them. And two things happened to me. I realized that regardless of the tragedy, regardless of the grief, regardless of the monstrous challenge, some of us have not died. Some of us did not die, for example, on September 11th. This is what Ellie Gross meant by saying, I guess it's my destiny to live. And I come here among you humbled by that attack against the World Trade Center September 11th, that atrocity against so many thousands of men and women from more than 50 countries around the world. And as I listen to and I watch various New York City survivors express their rage and their terrified, seared consciousness and their inconsolable longing for loved ones lost and their sense of safety lost, may I just repeat this idea that, as Ellie Gross said, I guess it was your destiny to live. Some of us did not die. Some of us remain, despite the hatred, that violence, that murder, that suicide, that affronts to our notions of civilized days and nights. And what shall we do? And we who did not die, what shall we do now? How shall we grieve and cry out loud and face down despair? Is there an honorable, nonviolent means towards mourning and remembering who and what we loved? Is there an honorable means to pursue and capture the perpetrators of that atrocity without ourselves becoming terrorists? I do not know the answer to that, but I do believe that the fundamentalist anything bodes ill for the irreducible diversity of our species. I do believe that fundamentalist conflict burns at the core of our international fratricide. I do believe that we cannot aspire towards safety without respectful reckoning, with completely different religious worldviews embraced by most of humanity. This will take study and time, and even as I study and I respect and beg others to continue to do likewise, it seems clear to me that only inside a secular political state can we harbor and cherish diverse religions as well as other moral systems and practices. Religious beliefs must stay separated from political power, because otherwise the secular human potential of democracy itself will be comprised or snuffed out entirely. The humane secular potential of democracy rests upon the conviction that just because you exist, you, male, female, Jew, Gentile, Muslim, poor, rich, smart, beautiful, lazy, scientific, artistic, gay, straight, bisexual, Republican, you are equal under the law, and it is the law which reigns as the supreme organizing governance of our experience, our United States. This is the humane secular basis for our democratic state. And so I hope I can bestir ourselves not to rally around Caesar as the recent economist recommends. I hope we can bestir ourselves to rally around the emergency militant reconstruction of our secular democracy consecrated to the equality of each and every living one of us. Some of us did not die. We're still here. I guess it was our destiny to live, so let's get on with it. Scenario revision 1. Or suppose that gorgeous wing spread speckled hawk begins to glide above my body, lying down like dead meat, maybe start to ride a little bit, not moving. See, just flat, just limp, but hot, not moving. See him circle closer, closer, closing, closer, for the kill until he makes that dive to savage me an infant in inches from the blood flood lusty beak. I roll away, I speak, I laugh out loud. Not yet, big bird of prey, not yet. Have a great day. This has been the Black Blogger celebrating and reading the Black Masters. June Jordan.